host, Neelam Brar, and today we're honored to have a very special guest who has inspired millions with his insights on slowing down and embracing life at every stage. Our guest is Carl Honoré, a best-selling author, a broadcaster, and the voice of the global slowdown movement. Carl's TED Talks have reached millions of viewers, and his work has been pivotal in changing how we think about time, aging, and the pace of life. Carl, thank you for joining us. To start, let me ask you a question that we ask all of our guests. How old do you feel? And what is it about your life and the way you live it that allows you to feel that age?
I feel the age that I am, I suppose. I'm 56 years old and I'm happy with my version of being 56. I think for me, the benchmark or the sign that I'm living my life the way I should be is that I wake up each morning thinking, yes, another day.
What's driven you to this movement?
Well, I've realized now that all of my books start with a personal existential crisis of some kind. And that was very much the case with my first book, In Praise of Slow, which went on to become the handbook of the slow movement. And the crisis then was I just was so fast, right? I was racing through my life instead of living it. And I had a wake up call when I started reading bedtime stories to my son. And in those days, I just really couldn't slow down. So I'd be speed reading Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I'd be skipping lines, paragraphs. I became an expert in what I called the multiple page turn technique, where you try and squeeze four pages, but it never worked, right? Because my son knew the stories back to front. So he'd always catch me out. He'd say, Daddy, why are there only three dwarfs in the story tonight? What happened to Grumpy? And this lamentable state of affairs went on for some time until I caught myself flirting with buying a book I'd heard about called The 1 Minute Bedtime Story. So Snow White in 60 seconds. And I remember hearing about this book and thinking, hallelujah, I need that book now, right? Amazon drone delivery. But then it was a light bulb over the head moment. And I suddenly thought, what's going on here? Am I really in such a hurry? I'm prepared to fob off my little boy with a soundbite instead of a story at the end of the day. And I just thought, this is insane. I'm rushing through life instead of living it. And I thought I need to understand my own addiction to speed, but also the big picture. And that was where it all started.
You argue that aging can be a thrilling journey rather than a decline. What are some of the key adventures or opportunities that aging affords us?
I wrote my book Boulder, which is all about embracing aging as an adventure. I was a card carrying member of the cult of youth, right? I was signed up to the idea that everything about aging was a chamber of horrors, right? You hit a certain age, I don't know, 30, 35, where are we drawing the line nowadays? And then everything was downhill from there. Everything just got worse day to day. And that's patently untrue, right? I mean, obviously some things change in ways that we maybe not don't welcome, but many things stay the same. And a lot of things actually get better. And when I started to dig into the research, I began to find all kinds of upsides to aging, which completely rocked my whole view of what it meant to grow older because I had such a dim, grim, bleak view of aging. And then I started to pause. I began to do the research. I began sort of asking, talking, traveling around the world, and I came away with a very, very different take. So let me give you one example, right? I think one of the most common stereotypes about aging is that later life is depressing, right? That it has to be sad. If you think of the words we use to describe older people, they're all in that ballpark. It's all crotchety, cranky, grumpy, right? But that's not true. Human beings follow what's called a U-shaped happiness curve. We tend to start high on the happiness, graph in childhood. We fall steadily till we bottom out in middle age, then we bounce back up again. And in Canada, the US, and around the world, you find that the adults that report the highest levels of life satisfaction are the over 55s. And so that's waiting for us there in later life. If we take off the ageist goggles, we stop telling ourselves that, oh, I'm 40, I'm 45, I'm on the wrong side of 50, right? Just constantly feeding into this narrative that aging is grim, sad, boring, unhappy. And we allow ourselves to ride that happiness curve, there's a surge waiting for all of us in later life, right? And there are lots of reasons for it. I think when people talk about the happy grandparent theory, which is the idea that you go back to our ancient ancestors in the savannah in Africa, and if the grandparents had been sad, cranky, crotchety, constantly complaining about their sore knees or moaning about how life in the savannah was better when they were kids, that would kind of lower the mood of the tribe and decrease the survival chances. But if you have upbeat, glass half full grandparents, it increases the chances of the survival of the tribe. So this is, it's coded into our primate genes, right? This surge of beatness, this ability to see the world through a more positive lens. We have to we have to sort of take away the story we tell ourselves about aging in order to make the most of it. But once you do, you realize that actually later life doesn't have to be a hellscape of unhappiness. On the contrary, it can be a time of depth, meaning, purpose, joy, romance, all the great stuff that's out there. We can live lives of technicolor, right? Joy. But we have to get ourselves out of the cult of youth thinking to be able to make the most of that.
The reason I started Total Life was because personally, I saw my mother struggling with depression after major surgery and realized that she was starting to think that maybe this is just how life is going to be for the rest of life. And when I went to go research how to help mom, I learned that many older adults believe that depression is just a normal part of aging. And I thought, wait a minute, no,
Wrong,
like
wrong, wrong. I mean, that's just, yeah.
you've worked so hard, you've, built a family, you've built a life, and now you should be able to enjoy that life and celebrate all your wisdom and explore some of those things that you never got to while you were taking care of us. And so I'm always encouraging mom and dad to go spend that retirement money and go travel and go figure out what that bucket list is today to go to experience those moments they never got to, and to stay eternally curious. I've also noticed the media is starting to shift a little bit around aging. This year, for the first time ever, we saw the Golden Bachelor,
Yeah.
right? Which I think is a signal that maybe the media is also starting to recognize that our narrative around life is over as we age isn't isn't okay. What are your thoughts on like how we break these stereotypes?
Demographics have moved. We're aging population. There are more older people on the planet every day. And that matters because there's strength in numbers. And especially if more and more of these people are taking life by the scruff of the neck, they are launching businesses in their 50s, learning languages in their 60s, running marathons in their 80s, jumping out of airplanes in their hundreds, I mean, and when you see these role models, right, that's so important because it breaks the stereotypes. It tears down the myths that aging is all about decline. And it makes it not only permissible, but possible for people to say, I can imagine a different version of being 50 something, 60 something, 70 something. And I think the media is a big part of that. The Golden Bachelor is a very good example. I don't think we would have had a Golden Bachelor 10 years ago. The dial has moved, and now the culture is creating more space for older people's stories, for presenting them in ways that aren't stereotypical, that aren't sad, that aren't looking down on them. They're saying that you can have live a rich life at any stage. And sure, we're still going to have soap operas and reality TV shows about people in their 20s. But now we can make room for similar shows about people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on. And I think that's so important because you have to see it to be it. And if we're constantly pelted with images of unhappy, decrepit, lonely old people, then that's what we're going to end up feeling ourselves pushed in that direction as we age too. But if we see people who are out there smashing it, really making the most of whatever age they are, that it becomes easier for us to do the same. And I think social media is a big driver of this because every day, if you look on social media now, whether it's Instagram or TikTok or whatever platform you're on, millions of people are uploading their version of being 50 something, 60 somethings. And guess what? Those versions are a whole lot different. They're 180 degrees away from the old stereotype of, it's all downhill from 40 or 50. These are people who are lighting up the world, lighting up their lives at all ages. And as soon as you can see that, you think, well, you know what? Person's gone off and sailed around the world or learned a new language or launched a business and they're my age or they're 10 years older. Why can't I do it? So it just gets easier, I think, for everybody to take that step. And the more people who take it, the easier it gets. So you have a virtuous cycle establishing itself now. So I feel really optimistic.
I fully agree with you. I mean, given I run Total Life, I am constantly being fed amazing videos of folks that are like bench pressing at 90.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
I have no excuse not to be going to the gym if they can do that. And it's inspiring. And
It is.
if everybody could have those types of videos in their feed, I think we would all benefit society. Today, there have been so many reports around ageism, and whether it's subtle or overt. We've seen some really overt um, ageism aspects in even what's happening across the country with some of our leaders, and it's scary because it does trickle down into societal influence. So, what are your thoughts on how we can like really combat ageism and really help society or help people think about their their worth and their value at any age?
The first is, I think language is very important. If you look at our vernacular, so many phrases we use tell the same story, which is that aging sucks, right? So phrases that just trip off our tongue without our even thinking about it, like you forget where your keys are and it's a senior moment, right? Or you say you feel a twinge in your back and it's you're feeling your age. I'll give you an example. The other day I was watching uh, an interview on the BBC, and there was a reporter who'd been reporting in the Middle East for 40 years. So he knows this inside out, right? Bringing all kinds of knowledge and wisdom and background to his explanation of what's going on in Israel. And at one point, he's talking about something that happened in 1982. And he says, well, back in 1982, and he prefaced it by saying, I'm really showing my age here. But in 1982, da 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 da. And I thought, whoa, did I just hear what you, because what you're saying when you're saying I'm showing my age is I'm a bit old. I feel kind of ashamed of that. I need to put it out there so we can just deal with it and then we can move on. When in fact, you should be saying, I'm showing off my age because the very fact that you've got that experience under your belt means that you bring so much more context and texture and layer and nuance to this discussion than somebody who is, 30 years younger. And yet these phrases just come out of our mouths in all circumstances, both at work and in our private lives, and they reinforce the myth that aging is all about decline. So I think we need to be a little bit more conscious, a little bit more aware of the words and the expressions we use and try to change them around. So instead of showing my age, I'm showing off my age. Instead of a senior moment, a goldfish moment, right? I used to lose my keys all the time when I was 16. I didn't call it a senior moment then. We can be forgetful at any stage of life, and yet this idea of the senior moment again feeds into the idea that we're all heading towards dementia and physical decrepitude when that's just not true. So I think language, check our language, I think is a good starting point. Another suggestion I would throw out is to mix up the generations. Throughout human history, people of different ages mixed and mingled everywhere. That was just the way of the world. We were around people of different ages in the fields, in markets, at home, in the street. And then we got into the modern world and we siloed, right, into little bubbles where everybody was the same age. And it starts at school. Think your class, everybody's born within the same calendar year, right? And we find ourselves then cut off from people of different ages. And that leaves space for the toxic stereotypes and myths about different ages to move in and flourish. When you pull down those stereotypes and start to mix across the generations, you could take down those stereotypes. You could take away and sweep away those prejudices because nothing destroys a stereotype better than getting to know the person being stereotyped, right? So if you have friends who are 20 years older, 20 years younger, 30 years older, that kind of thing, it allows you to have a wider, richer, more honest view, a more optimistic view, I think, of your own arc of aging. And that's especially useful for young people. But it also opens minds in later life to keep exposing yourself to the novelty and the new ideas bubbling up in the new generation. So everybody benefits. We benefit as a society, we benefit individually. We start telling ourselves different stories about aging when we're exposed to people of different ages. So I'm a big believer in, whether it's joining I don't know, a dance group or a ping pong club or whatever it is, just getting out or having a chat with your neighbor who's a different age down the street, that kind of thing, and just exposing yourself to different people with different experiences. And I think that can help us all wipe away some of this ageist gunk.
If for those of our listeners who don't know, Carnival is this amazing festival. Obviously, it happens in a lot of countries, but in Trinidad specifically, you actually the community also gets dressed up into the outfits and joins the band and dances in the whole, in the streets in a parade for the whole day. But what really struck me was this wasn't just young people. It was all ages, from like kids that were just learning how to walk to people that were in, their late 90s, dressed in these amazing outfits, and just partying all day. And I thought, wow, that's such a great symbol of happiness and joy, that we can come together and nobody's too old or too young to be doing this anymore. Whereas often, I hear friends saying these days, I'm too old to do that. And I correct them quickly. You're too old to have fun.
Yeah.
Like, you're never too old
Yeah.
to go dancing or to, go to certain venues. It's just, it gets in our heads. And I think some cultures are really great at saying, let's all party together. Let's all celebrate. That joy is so valuable from a medicinal purpose, right? The dopamine that dancing can create, and also the physical activity it creates is just so
And social
wonderful.
connection as well, because of course, all the science showing that loneliness is as bad for us as smoking 15 cigarettes. We need that social connection. And if you dig back into our ancient history, it was all multi-generational, right? You had families, grandparents, everybody together. And that there's a particular kind of magic, I think, in that mixing. And it's interesting you're pointing at different cultures, because I grew up in Canada. I live in London, but I've lived in South America and I travel. I'm a journalist, so I travel a lot. And Southern Europe is much more inclined to have people of, big families. The family's more central to people's lives. You go into squares and you see families having big boisterous dinners together, in the evening and so on. And there's a kind of magic, there's a kind of alchemy that happens there. It just that people, no one is too old or too young to be part of that joy, that connection. And I feel like in the Anglosphere, in the sort of Anglo-Saxon cultures, we have so few examples of that. I was at a wedding recently in England, and that's somewhere where you do see it. You do see people of different generations come together, and immediately people light up, right? Everybody's out on the dance floor. People are mingling, they're laughing, they're telling jokes, and it just, you feel like those barriers come down instantly. But we've just created a society where those moments of commingling are less likely to happen. And I think that's an important part of rethinking how we live our lives and how we move through the world, is creating spaces and organizations and rethinking things like school. I mean, I do a lot of work in education as well, and I think it's so powerful to get kids teaching each other, like get a grade 6 kid to come into a grade 1 class and teach, and just already getting people thinking outside those age bubbles, and the extraordinary learning and connection that happens as a result of that.
There's companies thinking about, senior living, where you pair
Yes.
college grads in buildings with seniors, so that there's this cross pollination of wisdom and ideas and talent, and it helps both age spectrums.
Yeah. I went what in for my book Boulder. I went and visited one of the original senior homes where they opened up rooms, gave them free to local university students. And I spent a couple of days there. And I've been in a lot of senior homes around the world. And I tell you what, the atmosphere in this place was utterly different. It was just so sunny. It was so open. And the cross pollination, the friendships across the generations. It was just, I mean, it was almost absurd in how well it was working. And what you found, on top of the fact that everybody, was happy to be living there, and that the older residents, it was good for their well-being and health and so on, mental and physical. But also when you started asking people about their attitudes to aging, it had changed everybody's attitudes to aging. The young were suddenly far less appalled by the idea of their own aging. They were looking forward to growing older, and the older generation who were living there to begin with took a very much more open view of younger people, right? They moved away from some of those stereotypes about everybody being entitled and a snowflake and so on. They began to sort of open up to new ideas, and they put, new foods like hummus suddenly appeared on the menu, right? So it's just a kind of joyful experiment that worked very well. And that home in the Netherlands became a mark and a symbol and a kind of like example for places all around the world now doing a similar sorts of schemes where you open up room for younger people to live with older people, and
Yeah.
it just works, right? It's right there for the taking.
It is something that I hope companies embrace and include. For those of our listeners who are interested in understanding your perspective around slowing down when it comes to retirement,
Mhm.
what would be your advice? Because, I've personally seen my father over the last few years transition into retirement, and he's just as busy. He's filled his hours with many other things. And I think slowing down is not just about how much you're doing in the day, but also how you can embrace and appreciate the
Mm.
day to day and the moment to moment.
It's not about doing everything slowly, right? I mean, I'm not an extremist of slowness. Faster is often better. We all know that. This slow revolution is about doing things at the right speed. So sometimes fast, sometimes slow. You're playing with all the different paces and rhythms and cadences and speeds in between. And if you go a little deeper, slow is it's a mindset. It's about being present. It's about being in the moment. It's about doing one thing at a time. It's about giving to each thing the time and attention it deserves. Ultimately, it's about doing everything not as fast as possible, but as well as possible, which is a really simple idea, but one with the power to revolutionize everything. So if you take that slow lens and bring it into retirement, it's not so much about the number of things you do, but how you do them and in what spirit. So when people say, what's your advice for transitioning into retirement? My first suggestion is always to avoid a hard stop, right? I think this is something, there's research is pretty solid on this, that if people who go from a very busy 5 day week, full on, and then just from one day to the next, suddenly empty schedule, nothing going on, that, that, that there's whiplash, right? And people could pay a price physically and mentally there. I think it makes sense to have a slow transition, right? So you're maybe going from 5 days to 3 days, and then you have a landing strip, right? You're kind of a glide path as you slow down, and then you find the right balance for you. So you want to keep on keeping on. You want to remain engaged. You want to keep an open mind, an open heart, be curious, try new things, all that stuff that keeps us cognitively and physically sharp and alive to the world. You want to keep all of that, but you also want to avoid feeling guilty about no longer being a salary earner and therefore assuaging that guilt by making yourself too busy, right? I think that sometimes happens that people feel, oh, I was a CEO or oh, I was head of a department and people answered me and now suddenly there are no emails. And then I think that the pendulum then swings too far to the other extreme. We start to try and fill that void with too much. So I think I usually recommend to people to take a bit of time to slow down, reflect, look at the big picture, join the dots, ask yourself questions. What do I want the next 10, 15 years to look like? What is the right balance for me? Where does the formula, the recipe of fast and slow, busy and not, where do I want my pendulum to rest comfortably in the middle? And just take the time. Don't rush into anything. Because I think there's a temptation, especially in our fast forward culture, to leap from one thing to the next. We've lost those liminal spaces, those moments in between chapters where we pause, we process what we've been through, we assemble some ideas, lessons, and then we look forward and we make some choices of what we just go blind to the next thing. And I think especially at the end of a working career when you're now moving into what we call retirement, which I think has been reinvented and rewired anyway, but let's call it that for shorthand. That's a very important moment to just take some time, travel, drift around, let your mind wander, talk to your partner, your family, and take time to build up what the next chapter will be rather than diving straight in, I would say.
What are some practical tips as they're taking that time to figure out what the next
Mm.
phase or chapter really looks like?
To expose yourself to novelty, because I think that will open you up to new side parts of your character that maybe had just been sort of dormant as you were stuck in, or not stuck, but you were in the world that you were in. You were living that life for maybe 20, 30 years, just to change the scenery and kind of change the chip a little bit, allow you to rotate the world and see it from a different angle and give you a fresh perspective and a fresh new way of looking at things. So I think travel is a really useful thing. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to go to Southeast. You don't have to, you could just go to the cabin or something, whatever, just to get out of the kind of physical place and get somewhere new. So I think that's useful as well. I think also to just to try stuff out, just put yourself out there. You don't have to sign up for something and then that's it for the next 5 years. Just if you've never been in a book club before, you've been interested in archery or whatever it is, just go along and just try, roll the dice and then let the chips fall as they may, just see how things play out. And then a third tip I would give to people is to talk to people who are maybe a little bit further down the same track, who've been through this transition that you're now going into. And those could be close friends, they might be acquaintances, it might be a network through your organization and company that you can tap into, and just get a little bit of perspective from somebody who's further down the same road, because that can be very helpful as well. You can get yourself whipped into a state of panic and thinking, oh no, you don't see the horizon. But just talking to somebody who's been through that can be really helpful, just for widening the scope, allowing you to sort of see see pathways you might not otherwise contemplate.
In America, loneliness and isolation is a massive problem, and even sometimes social people feel lonely. I personally have felt lonely after a whole day of socializing.
Mhm.
And so what's your advice for our listeners on how we can cultivate more meaningful relationships by embracing the slow movement?
People often assume that older people are more lonely, but actually, if you look at the stats recently, it's the young generation who are more lonely, who are suffering from loneliness more, who have fewer people they can turn to in moments of crises and so on. So it's another reminder that some of the stereotypes we have about aging are wide of the mark. How can we combat loneliness and build those deeper connections? I think a good starting point is, well, let's talk about tech, right? I mean, we're so distracted by our phones. Just simply having a phone. I mean, there's done some research showing that having phone on the table between two people when they're having a conversation, those two people keep the conversation at a more superficial level, right? Because one of them's thinking about what's on the phone or and that could be two friends, parent, child, whatever it is, parent, husband, wife. So a simple way to deepen the connection you have with someone is to hide your phone, right? Like a super simple hack is to put the phone in your bag, or as I've done here, under my hat, right on the desk. It's just not there. So rethinking our use of these weapons of mass distraction that we carry around with us everywhere, um, just to get the screens out of the equation. It's wonderful to have social media. It allows I couldn't live without it. It allows me to stay connected to people around the world, but you can only go so far with someone on Zoom, right? So make sure you're carving out moments when you're one to one with somebody, phone switched off, out of sight, taking a walk in the park, building in those moments when maybe you have times of awkward silence. That's fine. You might feel you run out of conversation. That's fine too. The human relationships are a little bit messy and a bit ragged. They don't have to be smooth and frictionless, to accept and embrace the whole complexity of human friendship and relationships is a glorious thing, but it does sometimes mean feeling a little uncomfortable. Be okay with that. I think nowadays we run away from discomfort. It's easier just to pick up our phone and look at our phone when we can't think of what to say to somebody. Don't sit with the discomfort. Roll through it, because that builds the complicity with the other person, because that person knows you're uncomfortable. You've come through the discomfort together. You get out the other side, and you've got a deeper connection, I think, as a result. So feel comfortable with discomfort, I think, is a really important thing to think about.
One of my friends said to me, you've got to make the uncomfortable comfortable, and that's when you know you've done the work.
There you go.
And I let that sit with me, and I stayed in Vancouver for 3 years and really invested that time in strengthening my family relationships, and it's left me in a much better state of mind, and much more fulfilled. So it's absolutely true. Sometimes you have to push through that
You
uncomfortable.
do. Yeah.
Your book, uh, your book, Bolder: How to Age Better and Feel Better about aging, challenges ageism and celebrates the later stages of life. What inspired you to write this book, and how does it tie into your broader mission?
For me, the spark for writing this book was a ball hockey tournament. Actually, I'm a big ball hockey player. I love the sport and always have done. And I play at a high level in the UK where I live. And I was at a tournament up in the north of England, and there were sort of 150 players, a big national tournament. And I was playing for my team, the London Jets, and we were in the quarterfinals, and we were locked in a 0-0 tie with a team that we'd annihilated the year before. We just couldn't get the goal we needed to get in the semifinals. And I could feel the nerves and the indignation coursing through my teammates. And then out of nowhere, I scored the goal that got us into the semifinals. And it wasn't just any goal; it was one of those highlight reel all of the month specials that I'll be dining on forever. And so we won the game. I came off. I was just floating on air. I just felt like Connor McDavid, right? And out of nowhere, one of the organizers of the tournament sidled up to me, said, "Great goal, nice one, yeah." But guess what? I've been looking through player profiles. And it turns out that you are the oldest player at this tournament. And I thought, I mean, I knew I was one of the oldest, right? I'm not deluded, right? Uh, but suddenly to be the oldest just rocked me to my core, shook me to my foundations. And just in the blink of an eye, I went from goal scorer to granddad. Like it was all these questions began crowding in. I began to think, well, are people, I think, me behind my back? Do I look out of place here? Should I take up a more age appropriate pastime like bingo or something? And it was just like suddenly my age, my chronological age had taken on this terrible power to define and limit me. And I came away from that tournament thinking, how can this be? This just can't be right. I'm playing well. I'm having fun. I'm doing what I've always done. And now suddenly the numbers on my birth certificate are hung around my neck like an albatross. And I thought, no, this can't be right. And I just came away thinking there has to be a better story to tell about aging, right? There just has to be a different narrative out there. And spoiler alert, there is, right? But that was really the launch pad. That was the trampoline to start just traveling around the world and investigating the history of aging and our attitudes to aging and how they're shifting and how we can reframe it and so on. And I tell you what, at the end of that book, I mean, it just totally like flipped my whole approach to aging. Because as I said earlier, I was a fully signed up member of the cult of youth, right? I was just by that point, I was in my, I guess, when I, that moment at the hockey tournament, I was probably 50, 49 or something. I was just pushing it away. I didn't want to think about it. I just, I was just feeling guilt and shame and the whole idea of aging. I didn't even want it to cross my radar. And then at the end of the process of writing the book and researching it, I just felt totally different. I felt this is my age, I own it, I'm proud of it, and let's go make the most of whatever age I am, So for me, it was like a kind of therapy, as all my books, in a way, I've discovered now, looking back. It's kind of like Dr. Heal Thyself scenario where I need to sort of fix things in my own head and make sense of the world. And I do it through writing. And that book really, really sorted me out on the aging front.
When I turned 45 this year, I really, it was like a pile of bricks hitting my head. I suddenly felt ashamed.
That's actually what it is at core. It's shame.
Ashamed. I felt like suddenly doors had shut. I felt like life was behind me. And I thought to myself, wait, what am I doing? I run a company that's focused on celebrating age
Yeah.
and living ahead of you and like there's better years ahead. And I thought, wow, it's so interesting because maybe God had me create this company so that it could help guide me also, right?
Yeah.
Because it's about there's so many negative messages hitting,
Mm.
especially women, I think disproportionately, that you're expired at a certain age. And I think it's getting so inspiring that there's more and more people that are willing, like you, that are willing to write a new narrative around celebrating your age and celebrating the opportunity of your age. There's still doors opening because of the experience
Yeah.
and potentially savings that you've afforded yourself. And there's so much more that you can do with a lot less stress because you're not worried about fitting in. You're not
Yeah.
worried about what people think as much.
Well, that's one of the wonderful gifts of aging. You feel less pressure to tiptoe around other people's expectations or worry about their opinions. And there's a great quote from the legendary agony aunt, uh, Ann Landers, who said once, at 20, we worry about what other people think of us. At 40, we stop worrying about what others think of us. And at 60, we realize they were never thinking of us at all, which kind of gets at that what's right the sense of liberation or freedom or lightness that comes upon us in the second half of our lives where you know who you are, you're more comfortable in your skin. That allows you to go out there and design the life that's right for you, because I think for many of us the first 30, 40 years can often just be autopilot, right? You're kind of doing what you think is expected of you. You're hitting targets that have been foisted upon you by, I don't know, family, friends, your own expectations that were cooked up over who knows what dinner 20 years ago. And then suddenly in your 40s, it just kind of, you think, well, you know what? No, this is my time. And Carl Jung, the famous psychotherapist, right? He said, life really begins at 40. Until then, you're just doing research. And I think there's an awful lot to that. And just picking up on something you said a moment ago about you setting up your company and in a way helping yourself. I feel like that with my book Boulder, that I wish I had written this book when I was 30, because it would have saved me 20 years of unnecessary angst and absurd worrying about like just dread about growing older. Because I tell you what, I mean, I was in my late 20s and I was even in my late 20s, I was thinking 30, I've got to get it all done because at 30, that's when it starts to go downhill, right? And then I got to 30 and I realized, actually, I'm feeling pretty good here, right? But 40, game over. And then I got to 40 and I thought, man, I've come on the top of my game. And then now at 50, and I'm thinking, so it's up and up and up. And I just wish I'd written the book, but I couldn't have because I didn't have the experience. I was so mired and marinated in the cult of youth. I just couldn't have got my head out of that trench to look up and see the blue sky ahead. So it's, yeah, so useful to have read it, written it now, but if only I'd had that experience.
Told me in my 30s to go live with more purpose, I would look at you with a blank stare because
Yeah,
in my 30s, I was like, climb the corporate ladder, be successful, become a leader. And you're just focused on what you think is the right way to live life.
that's so
Now,
true.
now it has totally changed for me. Like we run a company that's entirely focused on mission and helping seniors get access to affordable mental health services, and that purpose really drives everything I do. And it's interesting because I could do this for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years and not feel like it's work. So, what
Yeah,
are some actionable steps our listeners could take to really begin aligning their lives with their core values through retirement?
I think that taking that time to just to let the mind wander, to think, to feel your way around your life, look back, reflect on all the things you've learned. Because by the time you're at reaching retirement age, you've got this enormous onboard database of your own experience. I mean, I think by that point, people probably already have at least an inkling of what lights them up, of what's going to put fire in their belly, and what's going to give them that warm sensation of waking up in the morning and thinking, this isn't work. This is something I want to go up and do, right? I want to get out of bed, have my breakfast, and get off and do that. So just taking the time to think it through, right? Talk to people who talk to people who are in the area you think might be the area that you want to be in. I think that's the sort of start point.
And it's not just retirement,
Yeah.
transitions are tough. You're going from something you've always done to something brand new, and being able to embrace that change and be organized to navigate the challenges of
Mm.
that change is always critical.
And to do it slowly. Again, I just reiterate what I said before. Don't rush through those transitions. The transitions are so crucial. They're vital for navigating and picking the right, charting the right course next. And just take the time. Again, the discomfort, it will be uncomfortable in the transition. You think, well, I'm not really doing anything. I don't know what's coming next. But it's in that unknowing, that weird sort of liminal space that you find, you see the silhouette of what's coming next. You can't quite work it out. You take the time, you let it, and eventually things will come clear and you know what door you need to open next. So don't rush through that transition, whether it's the transition from work into retirement or maybe making a shift in your mid 40s or even in your 20s, right? At any stage, so important. Slow down. There's the slow message again, right? Take that time. Reconnect with your inner tortoise. Yeah, get off the road runner treadmill for a bit and just think, right? Reflect.
What are some really, really interesting stories or aha moments that have sat with you as you've done your research
Mm.
in writing these amazing books?
Well, one of the character who really stood out for me, a woman called Jacko, who is Lebanese, lived in Beirut. She led a very quiet life, running a boarding house in central Beirut. And then in her 80s, she was discovered as a kind of comedian, right? She became a comedian, and then she went on to a TV show that became a huge sensation across the Arab world. I think it was called Live Well, that would be the translation. And they just did skits, poking fun at state ageist stereotypes and so on. So the one that really made her name was where she wandered into a pharmacy in Beirut wearing a sort of old, I mean, she's a frail woman, she was in her late 80s. And she has a conversation about she's buying Viagra, right, for her partner. She's wearing a kind of house coat and all of it, just the characters, all the people who are the real people in the pharmacy are hearing this conversation she's having with the pharmacist about her lovers who's a lion in bed, and the expressions on people's face are just comedy gold, and it just turned her into a superstar, and she became this extraordinary kind of luminous example of how you're never too old, and it's never too late to, well, C.S. Lewis, right, who wrote the Narnian Chronicles, famously said, you're never too old to dream a new dream or start a new project, right? And that she's a classic example of that, right? In her mid 80s, she became a meme worthy household name across the Arab world. And I met her, I went and interviewed her, and she was just such an extraordinary character and one of the most inspiring people I've ever met, actually. And she had her attitude to life had always been, whatever age you are, just be open, right? And just embrace whatever the moment brings you. And don't rush. She was very big on not rushing through things. Let it happen, let it flow.
What is your advice to our listeners who want to embrace the beauty of aging, given what you've learned and the experiences you've had through your books and the people you've met?
So I've moving from my cult of youth days to my, what are we going to call them now? My embracing aging stage. I embraced a new metaphor for aging, which is to do with gaming. I know I'm not a gamer at all. I didn't really grow up. I'm not interested in gaming. But the way games work, where you go from one level to the next. So I think of myself now, I'm 56 years old. So I'm at level 56, right? So at level 56, I'm going to get all the treasure I can gather. I'm going to take out all the bad guys. I'm going to, I don't know, what do you do and seduce all the princesses, whatever it is you do, right? I'm going to make the most of level 56. And from time to time, I will look back on level 29 and think, I had a really good time at level 20. Like my 20s were roaring, but I don't want to go back to level 29. I'm at level 56, making the most of it and thinking, what is waiting for me in level 57? What am I going to be doing at level 60? I'm going to be looking forward and upward. And I feel like having that framing, you have a metaphor that's not gloomy downhill, everything gets worse, and it's more about the sunny uplands, right? I think that's super helpful to have your own metaphor. Another one I like to think of is it was Michelangelo talked about as a sculptor, his job was to take a block of stone and to see the angel inside it and set her free, right? Like chipping away, right? And I think of that as a lovely metaphor for aging as well. Is that what you're doing as you're aging is you are chipping away all that stuff until you get to the essence. You're getting the core of who you are, right? David Bowie has a lovely quote about aging. He said, David Bowie, famous rock star. Um, everybody knows David. He said, aging is an extraordinary process whereby you become the person you were always meant to be. And I love that idea that aging is, you're not becoming less as you grow older, you're becoming more. You're getting down to the heart of the matter. You're getting the core, the true essence of who you are. And that just turns aging into this wonderful, uplifting adventure upwards, getting to the heart of things. I think having the right framing, the right metaphors, the right imagery for aging is really helpful. It can sound a bit cheesy, but actually I think it's really useful because we are creatures of metaphor, right? That's how we understand and process the world is through metaphors. If you have the right metaphor for aging, I think that sets you up in the right direction to begin with. Number two, role models. Super useful to have a pantheon of good aging role models, people you can look to and say, you know what, that person, I don't know, did this thing or that thing or looks this way or has this kind of energy or dances in this way and they're older than me and I can look up to them. I can think, okay. So one of my role models is a US Marine um, who a few years ago set the world record for planking. When you do a plank, and I'm pretty good at planking. I can do I think my record is 8 minutes, which is pretty good at planking, yeah. But he set the world record for planking, and he planked 8 hours, 8 hours, 15 minutes, and 15 seconds. And you just think, oh my! When he did it, he did it. I was 52 at the time. He was 62. He was 10 years older and he's planking 8 hours. You just think, no, I'm never going to plank 8 hours. But it means that I'm planking, say, 8 minutes. It doesn't mean that next year I have to be planking 7 minutes, right? I can look up, I can aspire, I can think upwards. And having those role models, I think, is hugely enriching and it helps you flourish and thrive. And if you can imagine a brighter future, you're setting yourself up for living in that brighter future. So having a pantheon of your own aging heroes and heroines, right? I think is really, really helpful. Another tip I always give to people is keep on learning, right? This is another thing that's so important. I've touched on the idea of novelty, but just get out there, every day, go to a website, a news website you've not visited before, experiment with a new recipe or a new ingredient, listen to music from a band you've never heard of before. Every just something new. Keep the novelty flowing, learning new stuff. That just keeps you sharp, keeps you on form, keeps you on point. And that's the case whether you're 21 or 91, right? So those would be three things that I would suggest as a good starting point.
Number one, setting goals and thinking positively about the future. Number two,
Pantheon of
having
role models.
the
Yeah.
list of role models is so important. And then, of course,
The learning and then
the
novelty.
learning,
Yeah.
continuous education. You also hear about like staying curious.
Yeah. That is crucial. Again, it's one of the stereotypes that people have to be, the learning is for the young. You go learning, earning, and then retiring. When in fact we should be doing all these things at every age. We should carry on learning. You say continuous education, exactly. Now in the university world, when we've got this demographic drop, fewer babies, fewer younger people, universities struggling to who's going to pick up the slack? Who's picking it up? It's older generations going back to university. I mean, I feel like every day I go onto social media and I see a story about a 90-year-old getting a PhD or, learning to become an engineer. I mean, people are just going out there and learning new stuff all the time. This is, of course, one of the most enduring myths about aging is that older people can't learn new things. I mean, the famous phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Yeah. Well, guess what? That's not even true of dogs. Yeah. It's certainly not true of human beings, right? We can go on learning new things all the way through our lives. And some things might take us a little longer to learn, uh, but we will learn them and we can learn them often more deeply. We learn because we've got the context and more background. We can learn in a more textured manner. So it's all there for the taking if only we just pull off those ageist goggles and step into this brave new world that's waiting.
Carl, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. I feel like I could talk to you for many more hours. You're just such a wealth of really actionable insights and information that is so easy to understand. For our listeners, if you're ready to slow down and embrace aging and live more intentionally, stay tuned to Mind My Age for more inspiring conversations. Remember, your best years are still ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.